Good afternoon and welcome to CSIS. I'm John Alterman, Senior Vice President, Brzezinski Chair on Global Security and Geostrategy and the Director of the Middle East Program. It is my great pleasure to introduce an old friend, Shaikh Nawaf Al-Sabah, the Deputy Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. He's been in that job for about a year and a half. He spent 14 years at Kuwait Petroleum, the last 8 as Deputy Managing Director and General Counsel. He has a bachelor's degree from Princeton, from the School of Public International Affairs, a JD from Harvard Law School. To my great frustration but admiration, he graduated from both institutions with higher honors than I did. I'm also pleased to have my colleague Kevin Book from the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS to help our discussion after the conversation with Shaikh Nawaf. He's going to open with a few comments, and then we'll have a conversation with him. We'll bring you in. There are QR codes on your seats if you're in the audience here and want to ask a question. If you're in the audience at home and you have a question, it's both in the YouTube description and also if you're watching on the CSS webpage, there's an Ask Question button. It will show up on this tablet here, and I'll be able to ask Shaikh Nawaf, so we will be able to have a very broad and robust conversation. So welcome to Washington, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you, John.
What brings you here and what can we learn?
Thanks, John. What brings me here, obviously, is really to have a good conversation with you. We've had this discussion a while ago, and I said next time I'm in Washington, I would love to have a forum with you, because the nexus between energy policy and what we do in Kuwait with what CSIS does and its analysis around the world is really quite close. I'd like to touch on a few things today, if we could. I'll start off by saying, as you say, one of the things you missed is that I spent my formative years in Washington, D.C., so I had been in lots of briefings like this one, and I was always wondering why the people on the stage never really had good answers when they were posed. And then I realized it wasn't really the answers that were important. It was the questions that were being asked. So, before I get into certainly the questions that you're going to ask and from the audience as well, I just want to touch on 4 subjects really that build into what we're doing as KPC, how we are confronting the energy transition, and how we are tailoring our product mix to meet that. So first, let me be very clear on my first point here. The climate urgency is real. We need to decarbonize humanity's footprint, and we need to do that in various different ways. But specifically among the ones that we have to talk about is really the energy transition. It's an energy transition that must be fair and equitable to everyone. And here I'm talking specifically about the Global South that has not been served well in the discussions up to now. And remember that countries in the Global South, certainly some of the poorest in the world, are being asked not to develop their hydrocarbons resources or their natural resources as a whole. And in that case, they would be foregoing economic growth that industrialized nations had achieved by doing exactly that over the previous century. So that is neither fair nor equitable to those countries. And if the nations of the South are being asked to pay for a century of emissions caused by industrial revolutions in which they took no part, then surely the first step in this transition must involve some sort of technology transfer that would help these countries decarbonize their product mix, and it should not be a request on them to extinguish their rights to develop their own resources. Second point I would say is the path to net zero carbon emissions is neither single-faceted nor is it linear. And here, for the energy transition to be a smooth one, it must account for the energy, what's called the energy trilemma, which is security, energy security, sustainability, and affordability. And you really need all three of these to have a smooth transition. We've seen, for example, in Europe, before the invasion of Ukraine, the concentration, the heavy concentration, almost exclusive focus on energy sustainability. So there was quite a bit on sustainability, almost to the detriment, if you will, to energy security. Certainly when gas supplies to Europe were curtailed and ultimately cut off, you saw energy security come back up as a very important element, and that led countries to switch when prices certainly shot up for gas in Europe. That led some countries to switch from gas to coal, a far dirtier fuel than any of the other ones, simply because gas was no longer affordable, let alone available. So Europe, in that case, sacrificed some of its climate goals at the altar of affordability. But you really need all three to have a smooth transition. The third point I'd like to make as an introduction is that we have to recognize that we're going through an energy transition and not an energy switch. It will be gradual, but it will take some time. It is not something that you can legislate away by saying we're putting in a ban on internal combustion engines or what have you, simply by legislation without economic incentives to drive consumer choice and change. In any energy transition that the world has gone through, that humanity has gone through, it's always been a layered effect. We've never got rid of the previous energy source, even going back to biomass that's still being used today, wood, obviously coal. And by that token, by the way, there is more coal burned today than at any time in human history, even with the advent of hydrocarbons and ultimately renewables now. So we will continue to use every single one of those sources for the future, not because we like them so much, but because there is no way that we can meet the energy needs of the future without using every available source that we have in our basket, if you will. And here we have to recognize that energy demand is increasing at a rate faster than population growth. Between now and 2050, we anticipate that energy demand will increase by about 50%. That means that every source of energy that we have is going to have to be used. But the question then becomes, and the burden on us becomes, how to decarbonize those sources of energy. And what are we doing as Kuwait, as KPC, to reach those goals? So that brings me definitely to the fourth point, which is what we're doing. And that's one of the questions that I was talking about that need to be posed correctly. What are we doing? Yes, we are trying to ensure that our hydrocarbons remain the most sought after throughout this energy transition. Sought after by two ways. One, it's got to be the lowest cost, cash cost, and it's also got to be the lowest carbon intensity. In both of those points, we start at pole position right now. The Kuwaiti barrel is the lowest cash cost, and lowest carbon intensity barrel on Earth. But we're not done. We need to maintain that position, and we need to take it down to net zero. So part of our mission, obviously our mission as KPC, is to optimize the value of the hydrocarbons resource that the state of Kuwait has been given. And we do that by operating commercially and globally in an integrated and sustainable manner. We obviously have a burden to meet internally in Kuwait, to provide opportunities for our people to grow, and obviously to contribute to the Kuwaiti economy. But our contribution to the international economy is by setting out a roadmap that we launched just last month with details on how we intend to reach net zero carbon emissions and Scope 1, Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It is a process that will require collaboration with companies and countries certainly around the world, and it's something that's going to cost us at least $100 billion just to be able to decarbonize the Kuwaiti barrel. So our world now is facing competing priorities from different geopolitical and economic blocks. That's not new. But what is new is the existential threat posed by these competing priorities and the impact they have on our future generations. So meeting the needs of these future generations requires a diversified, secure, and affordable energy mix. And that's what we intend to provide into the decades to come. So with that, I'll pause and open it up for certainly the well-posed question that I'm anticipating from you.
Thanks so much. We have a lot to talk about.
Okay.
And thank you very much for those really interesting opening comments. I just want to start, you talked about the Global South and the issue of loss and damage. The committee just met over the weekend and came up with language for a proposal on loss and damage to talk about COP28 later this month in Abu Dhabi. What do you think the role of major emitters, particularly the US and China, should be on loss and damage issues?
Well, there was certainly there was the $100 billion a year fund that was going to help countries in certainly the Global South. It hasn't worked yet. It hasn't been funded. It hasn't been fully funded, and unfortunately, that's been a cause for some countries in the Global South to doubt the sincerity of the climate agenda so far. And I think that's why it's important that COP28 is going to be held in Abu Dhabi, or in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates in about 3 weeks' time from now, because it's the first opportunity to have a major oil producer host a COP, and they've been extremely inclusive in the discussions so far, and certainly there's been a promise by the COP president to have the most inclusive COP ever, and that will help in bridging the gap, bringing countries either as emitters, large emitters, or the countries in the Global South up to level. We don't see that. We hadn't seen that happen very much in the past. I think that's been a welcome relief to see what's been going on so far in anticipation of this COP.
But in particular with regard to China and the United States, large emitters, different histories, different current energy mixes. I mean, what is there a special role that China sees itself as part of the Global South?
Yes.
And arguably might be asking for specifically those loss and damage funds itself.
I think let's wait and see what they come up with, because I think this is part of the agenda on the meetings in Dubai, and certainly these are the issues that have to be sorted out for this to be a successful COP. At this point, the agenda to move forward on the energy transition is extremely costly. It's not going to be $100 billion a year. That's not going to do anything. By some estimates that I've seen so far, and they've been to get to where we need to be by 2050. You're talking about $100 trillion in investments in clean energy, and 70% of that will be to upgrade the energy grids. We don't have that ready yet, and in really any country in the world, certainly to absorb more electrification of transportation and other uses and industrial uses. So we don't have that yet. It's going to be a bigger dialogue than just that.
As you know, as we've discussed, I've been looking at China, Middle East things for more than 15 years. And a large part of why China's been interested in the Middle East is because of energy. Yeah. As a producer, what do you expect the China energy mix to look like in 25 years? Is it going to continue to be deeply reliant on the Middle East for energy? Is it going to stay engaged in coal? Is it going to turn away from coal? Is it going to develop its new nuclear technology to be a large part wind and solar? I mean, as you look at an important oil market, where's China fit in 25 years?
I think in response to your question, the answer is yes on all of them. Because, as I said, no single source of energy is going to be enough to power the world. Certainly China is one of the largest economies in the world and largest importer of hydrocarbons, will continue to need that. We have customers, and I call them business partners really more than customers, because as they grow, we grow with them, and as their needs change, we will adapt to their needs. These partners have been with us for quite some time. We anticipate they will continue to be our partners for decades to come. I'm happy to say that within KPC, for example, a fair percentage of our production and our national sales have been to customers that have been our customers for decades, and nothing has changed, because they built refineries to accommodate Kuwait export crude, specifically built for our type of crude. And because also we pride ourselves and invest to remain secure and stable suppliers for our business partners. Now, as the relationship evolves over time, the needs change over time. So whether if we move from crude oil sales to product sales, we made investments of about $30 billion in upgrading our refining system in Kuwait and building a new refinery that will provide the highest quality products to the markets, whether it's fuel oil or diesel. And in fact, when I talked about Europe needing new sources of energy after the cutoff of gas from Russia, it was a wall of fuel oil, and much of it coming from Kuwait, that came to the rescue. The timing was absolutely perfect, because we built a new refinery that produces fuel oil, and the use was straight into the system in Europe. Now, going back to China, where we see that mix changing over time in China, is quite a bit of oil will continue to be used, because it's used for industrial purposes, not just for transportation purposes. And the refining system is elaborate enough, and it's been built to accommodate, for example, from our perspective, Kuwaiti export crude. So we have no problem looking into the future and seeing that there remains a strong role for hydrocarbons in the Chinese market, along with others, as the Chinese economy continues to evolve.
All right, let me ask the last of my simple-minded questions, then we'll go to a real energy expert like Kevin. I would imagine that for energy producers like Kuwait, the United States is an odd duck, because we're the world's largest oil producer, and we don't act like any of the other major producers in the world. What does it look as? And you used to run the KPC office here in Washington.
Yes.
What does it look like as a country with a sophisticated approach to producing energy, engaging with the market, centralized way to manage production, to think about marketing, to this sort of radically decentralized American way where the Americans are always complaining about other people's production, but it seems to be not engaging in anything like a similar way with its own production. How does that look?
John, how quickly you forget. The Texas Railroad Commission was the precursor to OPEC. It was completely managed. It was a process where the Railroad Commission would set production coming out of specific individual wells in the state of Texas. So there is that history in the United States. Now things have evolved, obviously, over time. And it's great to see the U.S. market and the U.S. energy market rejoin the international energy market with the lifting of the export ban on crude and whatnot. But from where we look at it, honestly, without the advent of shale and shale production coming out of the United States, the international energy market, the oil market, would be extremely tight right now. It is not a case of, as the Economist famously puts on their covers, almost always wrongly. They had a cover of sheikhs versus shale at one point. It was not that. And in fact, we needed the addition of oil coming out of the production coming out of the United States to help balance the market. So as energy demand increases, as oil demand continues to increase, we will need additional production coming out of lots of places around the world. Let me put this into perspective. It's about 103 million barrel a day market right now for oil barrels. Every year, normal decline rates in existing fields are maybe 3-4%. Some people are saying 5 or 6%. But let's take a 3-4%. Let's say 3 million barrels, and that's an extremely conservative assessment. 3 million barrels a day of production capacity goes offline just through normal declines. That, by the way, is the production capacity of Kuwait. So every single year, you're going to have to find a new Kuwait to bring online just to tread water, essentially, to maintain production capacity right now as we see it, not even to find new barrels to grow. So if the United States wants to continues to have an oil industry that is essentially in a free market, and all well and good, whatever it takes to ensure that investment goes in to maintain production capacity and essentially to grow it is important. I think one of the things that we're most concerned with is an alarming lack of investment in production capacity that's happened since 2014-15 when the price collapse happened in that time. Exploration budgets dried up, very few new fields were found, and we need to continue to invest in exploration to ensure that we have a production capacity to meet future demands. So if the U.S. System works for the United States, you can see the production numbers going up, that's perfectly fine.
My turn.
Your turn.
So I think you used the words moving from sustainability to security, sort of a description of priorities, if you will. Mm-hmm. The priority changed. I think another way to think about it might be also that the protocols changed a little bit. If you go back to 2021, it was a very prescriptive transition we were hearing about, a lot talking about the inputs we were supposed to use. And it's evolved, I think, maybe evolving, this might be early still, into more of a performance-based transition, one where the outputs matter. You mentioned specifically carbon intensity, emissions intensity of production. That's one of those sort of output-based performance metrics that you might be looking to. It's strange to me, though, that we still hear so much about the relatively small share of energy that comes from those prescribed inputs when you consider that oil is a third of energy demand.
Yes.
I suppose it raises the question, what is the role of an oil company in the energy transition? Maybe people aren't hearing what it is you're doing, so tell us, what is the role of an oil company in transition?
Sure. I think what an oil company does best is essentially produce oil. It's in our name. You might laugh, Kevin, but actually we go through this existential question every few years when we revisit our strategy and refresh our strategy. I inevitably get someone within our organization who comes up and says, let's be an energy company, and not just a petroleum company, and let's provide electricity to the government, to the state, to the national grid, and we can do that. And the response is, no, the name is written on the door. It's Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. This is what we do best. For KPC, we have one shareholder. If our shareholder, the state of Kuwait, decides it wants an energy company, it will stand up a separate company to be the Kuwait Energy Company, and not staff it with a bunch of petroleum and reservoir engineers and geologists, but instead electrical engineers who can design electric systems. That's not what we do best. But what we do better than almost any other industry on earth is we can think on big projects, plan those things, and deliver them. The engineering feats that this industry has been able to accomplish over the past decades has been remarkable and pretty much unmatched among other industries. We can think those big projects out and deliver them. So that's actually what we should be doing, and we are continuing to do. KPC, for example, is focused exclusively on increasing our production capacity, but doing so in a sustainable manner and by decarbonizing. So the added mix that we're seeing right now is how do we ensure that the hydrocarbons products that we put out are the best from an environmental point of view. And that starts with planning and economics. On the economics side, we used to flare about 14% of the gas that we produced. I'm talking about a decade or two ago, a couple decades ago. That was essentially dollars being burned up every day. It didn't make sense. It was before, and I think people had started to think about the climate impacts of that. But we looked at it and said, those are dollars. How much do we need to invest to capture all of that gas so that it's not flared? And we looked through and made those investments. We are now flaring less than 0.5% of our production. We are leading the industry worldwide on the reduction in flaring. So we are basically almost zero flaring at this point. And we did that initially not because of purely for climate reasons, but actually it made economic sense. So the economics need to work with the climate goals so that we can have a meaningful outcome. Second thing we're doing in Kuwait is, as we grow our production, we realize that we've been producing oil for about 80, 85 years now. A lot of it has been easy production, and it's without the need for additional energy sources to help stimulate that production. Now, as we reach sort of a secondary stage of oil production, we do need additional energy sources, and one of the things that we're doing is using electric submersible pumps to help extract oil out of existing reservoirs. As their name says, electric submersible, they run on electricity, and if we're taking electricity from the national grid, that will increase our Scope 2 emissions. Because the electricity produced in Kuwait is almost exclusively hydrocarbons based. So what we're doing instead is moving our production, those electric submersible pumps from the national grid to solar to power those pumps. Now, let me be specific. We are not looking to provide or create renewable energy to feed the national grid. That's not our purpose. The government can do that separately, and it can stand up, as I said, an entity to do that on an individual basis. But what we're doing is lessening our burden on that national grid. So that's another thing that oil companies should be and are doing. One final point on the same point. You've seen how some companies, especially European oil companies, were under tremendous pressure over the past few years to change their strategies to become energy companies, to move beyond oil production and become electric companies and whatnot. That didn't work out for them. It didn't work out because shareholders, just like our shareholder, says, do what you do best, and if I want a different type of investment, then I can make that investment separately. And you see these companies now move back to oil production because it's needed and because that is what they do best.
So you've made the contention that we agree with at my firm at Clearview. The cheapest, cleanest barrel wins. That's almost certainly true. But there's a question along the way: in what form? By the way, applaud the use of sunlight. You certainly have that in
abundance.
Good supply. You should be fine. Not competing with the government for the sunlight supply. But you're expanding production. Your target for 2040 is to get up to 4 million barrels per day from 2.83, that range right now.
Yes.
But also increasingly producers are moving into the downstream. And this is not unique to Kuwait Petroleum, but
we were the first to do it internationally.
But there's a reason to think about what that product slate looks like in an electrifying world. How does it look? First of all, you may not believe that the world is actually electrifying transportation as much as some project that it might. So I'd be interested in any perspective you have on that. But if we are shifting a substantial amount of the light duty, at least, transportation mix into electrification, how does it change the product slate? What's the role for petrochemicals? And for that matter, are they something you can use for transition?
Sure. For the product slate, as you said, we're the first national oil company to really move internationally all the way downstream. So if you go through Europe, you'll see our stations there under the Q8 brand name. We have about 5,000 stations spread throughout Europe, and we were one of the first to introduce even unleaded gasoline into Europe in the 1980s. But we're proud of that position, and what we're doing now is leveraging that position through the energy transition. We're doing this in multiple ways. One, the new refining system that we brought on in Kuwait, $30 billion or so that I mentioned, is now providing ultra-low sulfur fuel oil, diesel product into our stations in Europe. So we're proud to say that we're producing a barrel of oil coming out of Kuwait, being refined in a refinery in Kuwait, being shipped on a Kuwaiti tanker to a port in Napoli, Italy, that is owned by Q8, transported through a Q8 distribution system to a Q8 service station, and ultimately being filled into a gas tank in Italy, for example. But we're also seeing, because we have a strong position in Northwest Europe, and certainly that part of Europe is electrifying at a faster rate than the rest of than Southern Europe, let's say. We're seeing that our customers, and really our fleet customers that form the backbone of our customer base, are asking for solutions that hit all of the sources that they need. So for them to continue to use a Q8 card, we have to provide gasoline, diesel, and EV charging. And we're doing that. We're launching EV chargers throughout our service stations in Europe for a couple of reasons. One, because they make a lot of business sense. They bring they keep our customer bases engaged with Q8, but also even on an individual basis for EVs, we can use the infrastructure that we have at these service stations to attract customers who charge their EVs and then go to the little shop and buy some more things. By the way, in the pandemic in Italy, for example, I think we were better baristas than we were selling hydrocarbons because they weren't being used. But in response to that question, yes, we are moving with our customer base as that customer base evolves. Now, in petrochemicals, for example, that's certainly a part of a segment of the business that we want to concentrate a lot more on and build out even more. You can take a barrel of oil that's been in the ground for 1 million years and then combust it and move a piece of metal 10 feet. Or you can take that same hydrocarbon and then create something else out of it. And if you could create a plastic, a durable plastic that is used in modern life, then you have created something quite significant. And let's be honest here. Hydrocarbons are used in everyday life, and there's no substitute for them. And not only are they complementary to life, they are essential to life. Something like 80% of things that a surgeon touches in a hospital operating room come from hydrocarbons. So we need to ensure that we make that energy available, but we decarbonize as much as possible.
Well, I think that's a good thing. I think a lot of people might be surprised to know that you're serving electricity along with your lattes in Italy. Probably if you heard it here first. Jon, I know we have to share the expertise with others.
Well, we have some excellent questions from the audience. I'm not sure actually who's here and who is online. If you are online and you want to ask a question, either click on the Ask a Question on the CSIS webpage for the event page you're watching this on, or in the YouTube description. If you're here, there's a QR code on the seats. The first question is from my friend and colleague here at CSIS, Ben Cahill, who asks, are you concerned that energy sanctions and embargoes are fragmenting the oil market and reducing efficiency or transparency?
Anything that is not a completely free market then does reduce efficiency and does reduce transparency. So obviously, the answer would be yes. Now, or it does. Now, how concerned are we on that? Look, the oil market has never had every country. If you look at OPEC, for example, or even other just the international oil market, you've never had every producing country producing freely on probably one single day in history. There's always been at least one or two countries, if not more, that have been under war, sanctions, any other geopolitical influence. So you've never actually seen what this energy system can produce for one single day.
So of course, weather and other things, mechanical breakdowns. I mean, all sorts.
Those things happen all the time. But I'm talking about geopolitical, because I think that was Ben's question. Yes, it does reduce efficiency and transparency, but we are gaining much more in terms of transparency now with technology. We now know we can see what people are producing. We can see tankers coming in and out. We can track movements. We can even look at satellites now that look at methane emissions, and we can surmount some of the obstacles from the transparency side of things. The efficiency side, no, it is a concern. It's a concern when countries that aren't able to produce as they should be. I mean, unfortunately, you have countries that where you've had political interference decimate an oil industry, and that's been catastrophic for the country, and really has impacted the international oil market as well.
On the issue of methane emissions and other aspects of gas, a Georgetown student named Omar Abdel Latif asked, does Kuwait plan to expand its natural gas exploration and production efforts?
Oh yes, absolutely. A lot of the gas that we produce in Kuwait has been associated gas. That's gas that comes up with the production. We have found non-associated gas fields, which means rich gas fields. The one that we're targeting the most is the Jurassic gas field, and that has been an excellent gas field. We're now up to about 550 to almost 600 million standard cubic feet a day of production from that field. It's actually the highest. We just broke a record this past month for the highest non-associated gas production in Kuwait's history. But that we're not done. We want to reach ultimately a billion scuff out of that, and then ultimately 2 billion by 2040. We will look into existing gas fields that we have yet to develop, and we are developing an offshore gas field that we co-own with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we have quite a bit of exploration coming up on specifically targeting gas. And we anticipate that there's going to be quite a bit of gas that we will find and will essentially make Kuwait self-sufficient on gas.
We have a question from my friend and colleague Natasha Hall here at CSIS, who notes that you've talked about reducing flaring to almost zero. Is there a Kuwaiti role helping others reduce flaring? Of course, there's the issue of Iraqi wells flaring profoundly.
Yes.
Does Kuwait have a special opportunity to help reduce flaring in the industry?
Absolutely. We take our role seriously, and it's something that we're proud to do to help others, because we actually need help in other aspects of the business. So by that mutual cooperation that we are talking about, we can actually get some of these solutions. One, for example, the flaring of gas in southern Iraq specifically. We have gone to Iraq in the past and offered to buy that gas. There were pipelines that were existing for decades ago that we can utilize. Unfortunately, we were not able to reach agreement on how that would work. We continue to offer our neighbors in Iraq the ability to help with gas flaring by certainly taking some of that gas. But I think they have now an intention to make investments to utilize that gas within the Iraqi system, so they don't need to sell it on to us. But we're cooperating with other countries in what we've learned. And by the same token, we invest internationally through our international upstream investment company in projects that bring a technology and reservoir management practice element that we can transport to Kuwait. Specifically, we are in a project with a partner in a shale play in Canada. Not because we intend to immediately produce shale in Kuwait, although we have plenty of it, but we recognize that ultimately, when we're talking about decades into the future, we will have to tap into that shale, and to build up that knowledge base now over time, where we embed people into that project, bring them back to Kuwait with that knowledge that we can apply in Kuwait. That's part of the knowledge transfer that I'm talking about.
Along those lines, there's a question from Anisa Zuni, an independent consultant, about how much your aging fields pose a challenge to your position as a low carbon footprint producer. And of course, if you were doing shale, that would also affect that.
Sure. As I said, we've been producing for 8 decades, so it's not a surprise, neither for us or anyone in the Gulf, specifically our brethren in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or the others, that as these fields age, they need, to use the vernacular, more tender loving care. They need secondary recovery techniques that are, as I talked about earlier, are more energy intensive. So by decarbonizing that energy that we are bringing into stimulation of the production, we can maintain those Scope 2 emissions at the same level. And that, I think, would keep us at least at the same level where we are now. It's really at the forefront. But we recognize that that's a massive effort for the future. But we have a plan to take those emissions essentially down to zero on a net basis. We'll offset them and abate them in other ways.
Can I tag on to that, though? And so if you're talking about the pathway to enhanced recovery, there's a a certain salutary form of recovery that sequesters carbon dioxide in the formation.
Yes.
Have you plans on?
Absolutely. We started a pilot project now to use CO2 to replace the gas that we're otherwise injecting into the reservoir. We found, from a technical point of view, CO2 is a better injector than gas into an existing reservoir for stimulation of production. It actually gives you a better outcome in terms of production. The problem, however, is CO2 has a tremendously corrosive effect on the metallurgy, on the facilities, the things that we've built for billions of dollars and expect them to last for a couple of decades. If you have huge amounts of CO2 coming through for something that they were not designed to take, then the replacement of those facilities dramatically increases the cost of using CO2 for CCUS. We can capture all the CO2 coming out and keep it circular, and so it's essentially in the ground. But we need to work with the research institutions, we need to work with companies and service companies around the world to find the solution for the corrosion effects from CO2 on the facilities. Now, you can line them in ways, or you can design new ones, but the new ones are really going to be quite expensive. So we're trying to partner with research institutions around the world to do that. One of the things we're facing, however, is that under pressure from ESG proponents, some institutions are reluctant to work on anything that ultimately decarbonizes oil because it still has oil as an element in the energy mix. And we found that some places are saying this isn't something we can do, that we can justify. And I think that's unfortunate. I think we need to work together to ensure that we have every source of energy that we need for the future, but really work to decarbonize all of this.
I have a question here from Antonio Campos, who said that you talked about the substantial investments required for updating grids to support the global energy transition. What's the policy framework that's necessary to facilitate that transition? Specifically, what kinds of policies and regulatory changes do you think are necessary to encourage the development of new, more resilient and energy efficient energy grids? Yeah.
I won't profess to be an expert on energy grids and how the system works. So,
but on the regulatory piece, I mean,
yes, on the regulatory side, I think it's as long as, and I won't be able to be specific on this because I would leave it to my colleagues who are expert on energy grids and the regulatory aspects of it. But you will need to ensure that regulatory frameworks stimulate investment. Now, the IRA here in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, has quite a few dollars for various aspects of this business. But if you take a look at the energy grids right now, no one is prepared. No one is prepared for an inflection point in EV penetration because the charging infrastructure isn't ready. So the amount of money that we're talking about that needs to be invested for electrification and upgrade of the grid is such a scale that a regulatory framework needs to come in to stimulate that investment. It's not going to be government investment. No government has the ability to spend all of that money. It's got to be through private sector and creation of incentives and subsidies. One of the things I've always found interesting is how Norway has been able to move into electrification. One of the major oil producers in the world, but the highest probably EV penetration, I think, in the world. They did it by subsidies, by creating economic incentives to drive consumer choice. Now that they've phased out the subsidies on EVs, or I guess it was negative subsidies on internal combustion engines, it's going to be interesting to see how the consumer reacts. We don't have the data yet on it, but it may not be a good model for the rest of the world, but it's certainly something, a data set that would be interesting to regulators as they decide on that framework for stimulation of investment in electrification.
One of the things Kevin and I were talking about as we prepared for your visit was the fact that you used to run the KPC office here. KPC doesn't have an office here. You talked about the extent to which the IRA changes incentives. A lot of this is complicated. You have issues with the international financial institutions. Do you think it makes sense for a major national oil company to have an office in Washington just to understand what's happening and to put forward the country's views?
I think it certainly makes sense to have international oil companies have the ability to understand how policy is formed in major places where policy is getting formed. It's also important, as I mentioned at the beginning, to have voices heard in fora that define that policy, COP28, for example, and other places, where we can have both information gathering and also essentially having a platform for your voice to be heard. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have physical offices in places, and it can be exchanges, people coming back and forth. Certainly, everything that we learned during the pandemic means that we don't need to travel perhaps as much as we needed to in the past, but in many, many cases, there is no alternative for actual physical FaceTime.
And as you would think about setting that up, what would your own experience in the KPC office sort of drive you toward
certainly, when I was here in the early 2000s, it was a timeline that was quite important because at that time I remember the United States was looking, and as you always do, at what's the future of energy demand and where supplies are coming from. And I recall having very good discussions with people in the Energy Information Agency, part of the DOE, and at various other locations around during that time to help U.S. policymakers understand our perspective and where we saw things going. At the same time, when I was here, it was also this. It was during the build-up and ultimately through the Iraq War, and we also needed to have that office represent the cooperation, the intense and very close cooperation that we had and continue to have with the United States and to supply fuel to U.S. forces in Kuwait.
On the regional piece, I mean, the Washington piece is important. There's a regional policy piece, I think an increasingly active regional policy piece, and it seems to me that, and Kevin and I were talking, that there are different national strategies for the energy transition in the GCC. Do you see them as competitive? Are they complementary? Should they be more coordinated? Should they be more similar? Or is variety good?
Excuse me. Variety is always good, but what I'm seeing right now is quite a bit of complementary policies. I talk with whether it's Amin Nasser at Saudi Aramco or Dr. Sultan Jaber at ADNOC, and certainly Minister Kabi at Qatar Energy, where we've promised each other open books on how we are moving through the energy transition, what we're doing in terms of our energy policies and climate policies. And we are exchanging quite a bit of information and learning from each other. So it's actually been quite effective. We, for example, are looking at what other countries in the Gulf are doing on blue and green hydrogen, and trying to understand whether there's a market yet for that, and what kind of investment is needed. Right now, it doesn't look like it. It looks quite expensive. It's part of our mix for the future, ultimately to produce green hydrogen, because we do have, as Kevin says, quite a bit of sunlight that we can produce energy from to essentially produce green hydrogen. But right now, there's not that market, and the cost is prohibitively high. So we're cooperating with each other, trying to, so that we don't do the same experiment, twice and reach the same conclusion, and instead learn from each other.
You mentioned there's lots of sunlight, there's a lot of heat in Kuwait. Kuwait has some of the hottest temperatures on Earth and an increasing number of sand and dust storms, both of which undermine people's ability to work outside. Will Todman from the Middle East program asked, to what extent do climate crises threaten your operations, and what are you able to do to adapt or to mitigate their effects?
We haven't had any serious effects on our operations. Looking at it from the upstream perspective, for example, the oil production. Oil production continues without much regard to dust storms or anything else that might happen. On the refining side, they do affect sometimes, and we have contingencies built into our refining system that we haven't had any outages or hiccups as a result of dust storms. Occasionally, you also get high seas, for example. That may affect the ability of tankers to load, but that's pretty much normal as weather-related patterns go. But in terms of increases in dust storms, we've catered for that.
You mentioned sanctions sort of as a fact of life. Not maybe you didn't put it into those words, but you were resilient to the perturbations that come from governments. There's an evolving trend in economic force projection towards using border adjustments, carbon border adjustments. Now, as a clean, cheap barrel, I suppose you could argue this is a flattering context for you to sell into. But I was wondering what you thought about the possible fragmentation of trade, not just from sanctions, but also from the use of carbon tariffs in the West.
Ultimately, there will. I was describing how in the future we want to make sure that our barrel remains the lowest carbon intensive, and it can be from the simple point of view that a consumer will either pay more for that type of a barrel, or it will fetch less. A high carbon barrel will fetch less, either because of consumer choice and demand, or because it's taxed in a certain way. And those can be either or, and from a producer's perspective, it doesn't really matter if you're either way, because you're getting less for that barrel. So you should make that investment to decarbonize that barrel to the extent possible. Any externalities that play with how markets work obviously create inefficiencies, but sometimes you do need to drive consumer behavior, drive even producers in certain ways. That we make sure that happens in a way that does not prevent investment in the upstream business. Because I go back to the same point we started off with. There has been a massive underinvestment in upstream businesses, and I'm concerned that in the future, with the increases in demand that's required, you're not going to have the supplies. When you just take a look at the major countries in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia certainly at the top of them, but also Kuwait and the Emirates, are three plans for those three countries on how to increase our production capacities. Will probably be enough to offset declines for 1 or 2 years. 2 years probably of normal declines. Well, what are we going to do with the rest of time? And that's where a lot of investment needs to come in.
For sure.
When you and I had lunch a little more than a year ago,
Yeah.
You said it would be interesting to come to CSIS and engage. And I thought that would be an interesting idea, but I never contemplated that this would be as wide-ranging, as interesting, as engaging discussion. I want to thank you for coming and taking me up on that offer. I want to thank our audience for excellent questions and for your attention. We look forward to having you back. And thanks to Kevin for helping provoke an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks.